It's happening. Adults across the country can buy cannabis. People have a lot of questions, so I invited some friends over to talk about it. Joining me today is Ashley Athill, a cannabis educator.
Worldwide, people know Canada for our qualities.
David Hyde, a cannabis security advisor.
The concerns that I hear from a regulatory perspective is that we have very high standards here.
Matt Mernagh, cannabis activist and author.
Everybody loves the BC bud and it got us on the map.
I'm Chuck Raffici, and we're talking the biz. With legalization, there's been a lot of talk that there's going to be a lack of product. Should we be allowed to import cannabis?
I think we're talking a couple different things here. If we're talking about the importation of genetic material, like plants to be grown, starter material, genetics, I think that definitely is it's time to begin doing that. I think the world hasn't caught up with Canada in terms of there's no other federal place in the world that has our system other than Uruguay, really. So I think when the rest of the world catches up with us, then Canadians should expect importation of cannabis. Until then, I think we have a healthy exportation market. And then if we get into the importation of cannabis, we get into tariffs, we get into the WTO, and I mean, ultimately, shouldn't Canadian companies be allowed to sell south of the border? Well, they can't, right, because there's federal regulations in the US that get in the way. Until all that kind of clears up too, I think this idea of importation, exportation for creating a marketplace is incorrect. And in terms of getting on supply, I think everybody's realistic. I think if you're not being realistic that the supply is just not going to be there for the first little while. I don't know what you're smoking.
I think generally phasing it in would be a great strategy. I am also a wine consumer, so I do like going into the LCBO and trying different wines from different regions, whether it be in Ontario, Canada, or worldwide. So I do want to have that variety. I do want to have the ability to say, okay, well, I just consumed some cannabis from Colombia. That's a nice feeling for me, but at the same time, I think the precedence really needs to be set on Canada right now. Let's get on board first before we kind of open those doors.
Certainly on the economic side, I mean, there's a lot of investments that have been made in Canada. A lot of people are growing and expanding quite heavily to meet the demand. Is it just inevitable that the cultivation is going to move to southern climates?
When the world catches up with Canada, and the world's probably at least 20 years away from catching up to us, I think inevitably the world will catch up. And then when there are trade agreements in place and it's not this government body of Health Canada making determinations on importation, exportation, and everybody has clear rules and there's tariffs or whatever in place or what needs to be done on a global scale, we're not even being able to access all the markets in Canada.
There are some legal nuances with the international treaties that are in play that Canada's signatory to, that they obviously feel they can exempt themselves against certain ones when it makes sense for harm reduction reasons or for medicinal reasons, etc. But there are some treaty issues in play, not only in Canada, but in the other countries that may be wanting to import. One of the main concerns that I hear from a regulatory perspective is that we have very high standards here, and in terms of the cannabis that makes its way through to the medical patient right now and eventually the recreational user, you got certain guarantees that is a quality tested and repeatable product that's not going to have harmful ingredients in there for you. Can we get that in other markets? Are we positive that the rigors are in there in these other quality regimes in foreign countries, particularly as we get further away from, say, G7 countries where there might be a lightness of regulatory structures and standards? These are the questions that I think will need to be kind of teased out before the federal government would feel comfortable, I think, opening up broadly.
That quality is definitely big concerns. But then we have international things like good manufacturing practices that are in place. And so it's a possibility and we're gonna have to face this coming up. I think Canadians would be shocked to think that we need to import cannabis. I think it's generally thought that we are the best when it comes to cannabis. It's, I know a lot of growers that definitely think we're the best. And the idea of importing would just be odd to them because, I mean, if you remember when I was getting into this, oh, Canada, we're exporting so much of our cannabis to the US. It's just like this massive export market. And the reality was, I think we exported like 2% of the consumption of cannabis in the US, right? Like, it's nothing, it's minuscule. But I think we want our own. I think there's something to be said about Canadian bud, or as we like to say, BC bud. Everybody loves the BC bud, and it got us on the map. And
This could be a good export.
it would be definitely
It'd
a
be
good
a great
export.
export. And we're not even talking about the States. The States is a whole other conversation. But worldwide, people know Canada for our quality. So
BC bud.
why not make that one of our exports, our main exports for the country?
I mean, today, Canada really is leading the world in exports. With UN treaties, we only have medical exports, but at least a dozen countries, if not 15, and growing, we're exporting to. But to me, if we're exporting, can we really block imports? At one point, is that a protectionist? Is protectionism good for our industry?
It is. If you wanted to be, yes, it is protectionism. But some of the countries we're exporting to, for Germany, for instance, their infrastructure is not up yet to supply their own medical cannabis. They look to Canada to get their program going. You see Australia, they're looking to Canada because the infrastructure is just not in place yet. And they're not just looking to Canada as the infrastructure, they're looking at us from a program perspective. And people need to realize that as Canadians. Like, we have fostered a program of medical cannabis on the world.
Yeah, and I guess the concern for some is that because of the the U.S. laws, particularly, they've really given Canadians a gift to be able to lead the global industry. And I guess will that lead be hampered with eventual southern climate production, or can we maintain that in other ways?
I think BC Bud will maintain it. So the moment the U.S. opens their market, I think Canadians will benefit dramatically from it. They can't consume enough. Even Canadians can't consume enough.
If you look globally and you look at the EU, for example, and you talk to people that know a little bit about that industry, Canada's well positioned and really isolated as being the gold standard for provision of exported cannabis into Europe, for example. The States isn't in the picture. If and when the States get into a position where they can and will, they've been growing for a long time too. They have their own cultures, the subcultures. They have a lot of, frankly, quite a bit, not all, but quite a bit of the smarts that have gone into some aspects of the system that we built here in Canada has come from experiences in the States as well as our own homegrown experiences. So I think, my view is when the States come into play, it'll change the game a little bit. I do think we'll be competing a little bit harder for that overseas export, for sure.
Yeah, I think the American market, but I think as Canadian producers, we're well known for our exportation of cannabis. It's people love our cannabis. It's got a reputation.
Yeah, I think the longer that they take to get on board, the more recognition that our brands will have, and the more respect our brands will have. And so, things might just teeter a little bit.
So in a way, you're kind of tacitly hoping that Trump stays in for another few years, even though it might go against your personal preferences.
But then there might be a brain drain, right? There might be experienced people who have worked in Canada will have definite opportunities to work in the U.S. legal market at a very high end, and it'll create more jobs for us. It's the benefit of being the gold standard is that there's opportunities for us globally that we never even thought we had.
I think much like mining, we have a lot of Canadian mining companies that own mines and operate mines across the world. I think we're seeing Canadian cannabis companies with investments in a lot of these other countries. So we might be importing foreign cannabis that's grown by a Canadian company. And so I guess, is it, from that perspective, maybe it's even a good thing.
It could be a very good thing. The other part is that cannabis is grown a lot different than other fruits and vegetables, where you can rely on low-skilled labor to perform those tasks. When we work with cannabis, the tasks are not low-end labor. They are farm labor-ish. There's bales and whatnot, but for the most part, you need someone that is at a higher level in the labor market, so to speak, a higher level.
More skilled labor.
More skilled labor. Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate that. Not higher labor, but more skilled labor. That might not come from some of these countries that have traditionally created goods for us.
Well, maybe they're higher too, but it's a separate topic.
Right.
It certainly appears that the grass is greener in Canada. Thanks for having this discussion today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's been great, thanks.